Hello to everyone, Harry here. Today I'm reviewing my very first Doctor Who figures, Patrick Troughton, the second Doctor, and along with the Cybermen from his era. But oh so bizarrely enough, the figures that I'm having a look at today were also the very last Doctor Who figures released by Dapol. Dapol was a company mainly specialising into making model trains, but during the late 80s and early 2000s, they had the licence to make some Doctor Who figures. And the Dapol Doctor Who models were really the first Doctor Who action figures ever made. Yeah, there were several toys and models before these, but nothing in the same range such as the Star Wars toys. But anyhow, since these two were the last figures released by Dapol for the Doctor Who range and manufactured in small batches, they're perhaps the most rarest out of all the Dapol figures. I picked these two up a couple of years ago, mint on the card, and at a much more lower price than how they would be usually sold on eBay. Here's several of the pictures I took of them when I first bought them. The packaging isn't something too spectacular, although if you're somebody that likes taking their figures out of box, but however like to display them in box as well, then I'm very happy to say that you can actually do it with the Patrick Troughton figure and along with the Cyberman figure as well. Since they're only in a plastic container, easily remove the figures out of box, but then very easily put them back in without much notice. So the packaging does succeed into being very collective friendly. It's just a shame that the packaging is rather bland and plain. The first figure that I'm going to be talking about is Patrick Troughton, and I've got to say, for the time that it was released back in 2001, the likeness is pretty good for a Doctor figure. I mean, if you compare it to all the other Dapol figures before this one, I think Troughton is probably the closest Doctor Dapol ever got with recreating his likeness. It's definitely recognisable as Patrick Troughton. Taking a look at the other figures, Jon Pertwee looks more like Wurzel Gummidge, Sylvester McCoy doesn't look like Sylvester McCoy. The only other Doctor I would say before Troughton that they got the closest likeness to was probably Tom Baker, with his big grin and curly hair, but I think Troughton is the superior figure. Yeah, maybe the face is a little bit soft, but it's a really small figure we're talking about. Unlike the character option Troughton figure, where since it's about twice the size, it gave them the chance to recreate the actor's likeness, but as for the Dapol figure on the other hand, it tries to capture much more of the character that Troughton was trying to play. Such as on the figure you've got the arms clapped together, which was something Troughton did quite often whenever he got excited. And there is a bit of sculpting detail to appreciate from the figure, such as you can see his dungarees and the pattern on his trousers are actually sculpted on. And the paint job on his clothing is actually a little bit different than the modern character option figure, as he's got a white shirt and a white handkerchief, something Troughton wore in his first series, where a lot of the modern Troughton merchandise is him wearing a blue shirt and a red handkerchief, which was something Troughton wore, but not until his much more later series. But anyway, there's nothing wrong with a white or blue shirt, but a white shirt for Patrick Troughton is a nice refresher to see. Now let's move on to the Cyberman, and I've got to say, this is another really nice Dapol figure we've got right here. A great improvement from the Earthshock Cybermen we previously had in the line. Where the Earthshock Cybermen definitely look good for the time, but they do look a little bit wonky. But this Cyberman right here is a perfect representation to how they looked on screen. Comparing it to the character option Cybermen, the amount of detail do look just the same on both figures. My only complaint about this Cyberman is that maybe his eyes are just a tad too big, where on screen they were much more smaller, but apart from that I don't really have any major complaints. Now on to scaling, and oh boy, if there's one thing anybody does know about Dapol, is that their scaling is way out of proportions. Okay, so Jon Pertwee and Tom Baker I would say was probably roughly the same height, but here John just towers over everyone. Troughton and Sylvester were probably the shortest Doctors out of all the Doctor Who actors, but here, it's Tom and Patrick that are the shortest here, and Patrick Troughton just looks like a child compared to everyone else. And with the scaling of the monsters, it's not much better. Troughton is shorter than a Dalek, even though the Daleks were much more shorter compared to Patrick Troughton. Troughton should be at least up to the shoulder of an Ice Warrior, but again, he just looks like a child in comparison. The only figure that he kind of fits in scale with is probably the Cyberman figure, since he's only just up to the shoulders like he is in the stories. So it does somewhat make these two figures even more exclusive for just each other. The only thing left that I haven't gone over yet with these two figures is the articulation. That's mainly because there is no articulation with these two figures, which is probably the only downgrade with these figures, unlike the previous Dapol figures where they had articulation. These two don't. But to be honest, I think just viewing them as being little models, I think they're terrific, and at the time were probably the best Doctor Who figures in terms of sculpture and likeness that were probably ever made, until character options came around about 4 years later, and it was a really good step up for Dapol. But the main reason why they didn't have any articulation was because at the time it was becoming more and more expensive for Dapol to add the additional articulation to their figures. So this new direction of better scaling and much more detail seemed to be a compromise for the articulation. But unfortunately this compromise wouldn't last long, as their license for the BBC wasn't renewed, so they couldn't carry on making any more Doctor Who figures. So as a result of this, several projects they were going to do had to be cancelled, such as their planned Yeti, which I would have absolutely loved because the Yetis are my favourite monsters of the 60s, plus a William Hartnell figure which would have been amazing. They would have redone several other figures such as John Pertwee, Davros, and even expanding to other BBC sci-fi shows such as Red Dwarf, but alas, they never came to fruition. But really looking back on it now, I think it was good for Dapol to stop right here, allowing other companies with much more resources to produce super detailed and highly articulated action figures. The way Dapol started off with their figures looking quite retro, but the way they ended with the high detail of Troughton, it was almost a good sign for what was to come. But anyway, enough about the history, let's get back to the topic. So, would I recommend these two figures? It depends on what you're looking for. I would personally recommend for a casual collector to maybe pick up the character option Troughton figure, but if you're a hardcore Dapol fan, or if you just really like Patrick Troughton and you're willing to spend the money, then I wouldn't say this is a bad addition to add to your collection. It's still a very respectable figure for a display piece, but I will at least say this is probably my favourite Dapol figure.